you all hear me? Excellent. My name's Jim Lark, and I have the honor of giving a presentation to you. I'm sorry, by the way, that Clint Bullock is not here. I've known Clint for many years, and haven't seen him in many years, and I was looking forward to seeing him. Fortunately, he was able to deliver an address to us yesterday. Actually, this is not unusual for me to be asked to be the pinch hitter for speakers. Usually the invitation comes in the following manner. People will contact me and say, Jim, unfortunately we've had a cancellation. We know you're going to be at the conference. We need a speaker who is a man of surpassing knowledge, wisdom, and wit, someone who will engage the audience, who will give them an interesting and informative talk. But unfortunately, no one like that was available. So would you be willing to speak? And so, of course, being the good sport that I am, the answer is almost always yes. The title of my address today is The Teachings of Chairman Jim, Sharing the Liberty Message. And I always like to use that, the teachings of Chairman Jim. Yes, it is a play on the teachings of Chairman Mao. I just happen to think that's clever. I should note that when I was asked to do this, I frankly wasn't sure what the best address would be, because this is an audience of libertarian sophisticates. So I wasn't sure what might be both interesting and useful to you. So I'm going to give this talk, and I guess we'll all find out whether I chose wisely. The outline of my presentation, can you see this bloody thing? It doesn't appear to. Let's try this. Yes. Also, 1 minute. All righty. The joys of technology. Yes. By the way, I'm not usually this good looking in terms of my photograph. I'm one of the world's least photogenic human beings. That went just there we go. What I'll do is I'll give you a little bit of information about me. Yes, I know that there was some information on the website, but I always like to give people at least some indication as to why I might be worth listening to. Then I'll offer a couple of points that I always make to liberty activists. Then I'll go through what I think are some useful and indeed important points to consider when you're sharing the message of liberty. And then finally, I'll be happy to entertain your questions. So let's get cracking here. I didn't want to work for a living, so I became a university professor, the leisure of the theory class, as we like to say. I hang my shingle in 2 departments at the University of Virginia in the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I'm sort of an oddball. I fit in a lot of different pigeonholes. I had the honor of serving as a visiting scholar at the Center for Study of Public Choice when it was still at Virginia Tech. Now it's at George Mason University. And then I was a visiting fellow at the Center for Research in Government Policy and Business at the University of Rochester. In terms of some libertarian activities, I founded and serve as advisor to the Liberty Coalition at the University of Virginia. I'm proud to say that in about a week, SIL, Students for Individual Liberty, will start its 38th year of consecutive activity at the University of Virginia, and I'm rather proud of that. I have the honor of serving on the Board of Advisors of Students for Liberty. I also am the secretary of the LI Board of Directors. I serve as chair of the Association of Libertarian Educators. The Libertarian Party couldn't find anyone good in 2000, so I ended up being elected as the national chair. I think the party did survive my chairmanship. At least no one has accused me of killing it off. I served on the LNC, the Libertarian National Committee, for 10 terms, and then finally decided to let some good people do the job. And then I helped Marshall Fritz get the Advocates for Self-Government going in 1984-85, and then eventually rose to a member of the board of directors, and then finally the chair of the organization. And it was with my work through the Advocates for Self-Government that I began working pretty seriously on how do we improve the methods by which we deliver the libertarian message. And Marshall Fritz, I think, does not get enough credit for helping libertarians to improve their means of presentation. And so I always like to mention his name. He passed away a few years ago. A couple of general comments. Again, I always offer these comments whenever I have the opportunity to talk to libertarian activists. There are 2 points that I think are extremely important. The first of which is, we of libertarian disposition must hold ourselves to the highest standards of intellectual integrity. We must behave with scrupulous integrity, honesty, with respect to those with whom we think we disagree. We have to apply the same withering scrutiny to our own ideas that we apply to the ideas of those with whom we think we disagree. Intellectual sloppiness is no more appealing when it comes from our friends than when it comes from our opponents. Also, remarkably simple point, treat people the right way. Treat people with courtesy and respect. I've found, and I've had the honor of traveling around quite a bit, if you treat people the right way, if you're a person of integrity, people will usually listen to you. And we can't really expect them to do more than that, but they will usually listen. And I found that I've been able to, there are people who clearly did not share my perspective, but because I treated them in a way that they evidently considered to be the right way, they were willing to listen to what I had to say. And I think I actually did stick a crowbar to use to wedge open their perspective on various political matters. I mentioned in the comments that I made yesterday, we libertarians need to understand rhetoric properly defined. In the English language, the term rhetoric now is frequently viewed as synonymous with sophistry. In other words, you're trying to put something over on, you're just using rhetoric. But rhetoric properly defined is, how do we structure an argument so that it flows in its most natural, powerful manner? Indeed, many of you are perhaps old enough to remember that rhetoric was actually it was part of the curriculum of the educated person in years past. And I think that it's very important that we understand, how do we develop our arguments? Now, by the way, this takes work in our effort. A simple observation, but one I sometimes find is not always observed, is we need to anticipate the objections to our arguments. And there are reasonable objections to the general libertarian perspective and to our suggestions for how things ought to operate. They're reasonable people of goodwill, sometimes have very good questions. We need to understand what those questions are. We also need to understand that there are many not very nice polemicists on the other side, and we have to have an idea of what they're going to be doing. In some cases, they don't play fair, by the way, so it's useful to anticipate what arguments you're going to see against you. I don't know why. I'm sorry. I'm getting a little slow in terms of advancing this blasted thing. Sorry. Usually, when I have I'm actually advancing it on my keyboard here, so my apologies. And then the final point that I offer is, prepare carefully and practice properly. And this is something, again, we of libertarian disposition, in many cases, we don't enjoy engaging people about political philosophy. When I was a much younger man, I was a basketball player and a soccer player, real football. And like a lot of men my age, the older I get, the better I used to be. Again, 2 years from now in World Cup star. I prepared myself to be a good basketball player, to be a good soccer player. I was willing to put in the time and effort. And in my observations of people on the other side of the fence, they seem to enjoy politics. They seem to enjoy being part of the takings coalition in a way that we of libertarian disposition, by and large, don't enjoy. We don't enjoy the political game. People on the other side do. And in many cases, they're willing to prepare in ways that perhaps we are not. So if we want to play in this game, if we want to win this game, and I do, I like having my liberties, we need to be willing to prepare, and we need to practice properly. We need to know how to do that properly. And toward that point about and again, bloody hell, I'm sorry about that. In terms of preparation, Bobby Knight was a great basketball coach in the United States. He won many titles, coached the United States Olympic team to the gold medal in 1984. He had this wonderful phrase. He said, people talk about the will to win. Do you have the will to win? He said, hell, everybody's got the will to win. Do you have the will to prepare? Do you have the will to work hard to be a good basketball player? Do we have the will to prepare to become effective advocates for liberty? I certainly hope so. One of the things, again, I noted this yesterday. I had the pleasure of participating in a panel yesterday. I don't convince anybody of anything. What I do is seek to facilitate conditions by which people can convince themselves. And I think that, by the way, many of the people I've encountered, I get the impression they don't want to have some idea rammed down their throat. They actually prefer to feel that they've discovered it themselves. And that's what I hope to do. I hope to help them ask the right questions. And then perhaps gently lead them in a good direction. Don't be disappointed when people don't immediately accept your ideas. And it's very disappointing for many of us because our ideas are truly beautiful ideas. The ideas of individual liberty and personal responsibility and societies based on those principles, it's a truly beautiful idea. As I said, I think it's actually a compelling perspective. And it's disappointing when people don't accept it, but understand, many of our ideas are actually counterintuitive. By the way, I should note that, as you probably already discerned, to some extent my presentation here is a little bit US-centric, and I apologize, but I think the comments I'm making are actually fairly widely applicable. Many of our ideas don't come easily to people. Minimum wage laws are a big issue in the United States, and minimum wage laws, I think by anybody who actually understands any economics realizes that all things being equal, minimum wage laws will generally raise the price, or frequently will raise the price of labor to the point where many people will not be able to get jobs who would otherwise be able to get jobs, okay? For many of us, in fact, I suspect for everyone in this room, you're going to say, well, gee, Jim, that's pretty simple. We understand that. For many of our friends and neighbors, that's fantastic. They can't believe minimum wage laws might hurt the very people they're putatively intended to help. Another big issue in my country is something called the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which has police powers over what you can put in your body for your health, safety, or comfort. The idea that having an FDA, and I'll put forward a little bit, I'll come back to this in a moment. The idea that having a Food and Drug Administration, that it may kill more people in what is ostensibly the effort to keep people safe by having safe drugs. The idea the FDA may have actually killed more people than it saved. You all may understand that because, again, you're a hip crowd. But for many of our neighbors, that's going to seem utterly fantastic. The idea that if you want to deal with the problems of drug abuse, that arguably the worst thing you can do is to make the drugs illegal. You guys you probably understand that pretty well. For some of our friends and neighbors, that's going to come like a thunderclap. So understand, many of our ideas are counterintuitive. The second point here, I want to address that, which is tied into the point I just made. How many of you are musicians? Any musicians in the crowd? I'm a very bad musician. I play several instruments with equal inability. I play violin, viola very, very badly. I play the drums very, very badly. By the way, I became the concert master of my hometown orchestra. You've heard of the blind leading the blind. This was the deaf leading the deaf. I played drums with a rock and roll ensemble, BDL for Barnaby Dixon Lark. BDL also stood for Bunch of Damn Libertarians, because we were all libertarians. There are things that I can do now as a violinist or a violist or a drummer. I don't think about them. I just do them. They come naturally. When I started playing musical instruments, I couldn't do those things if my life depended on it. But now I do them without any thinking. And I mention this because there are ideas that for us are so natural because we've thought about it. We've invested time to look into the data. We've thought about these things. The arguments have become second nature. When I was a schoolboy 50 years ago, and I'd done graduated high school 50 years ago. My mom and dad were so proud. There are a lot of things I didn't understand then that I understand pretty well now. If you had asked Jim Lark of 1975, are you a libertarian? The answer would have been no. And many of the positions I now embrace strongly, I would not have embraced then. I like to flatter myself with conceit that I've done pretty well on this libertarian thing now. I think I kind of wised up. So understand that some of the ideas that now we find it hard to believe that anyone can't understand, maybe that's because we've thought about these ideas for years and they become second nature. An extremely important point. Again, this is a hip crowd, so I suspect this, you already understand this, but the fact that some people do not embrace our perspective is not a sign that they're either stupid or venal. I have plenty of friends, of course, being an academic, this is not surprising, but I have plenty of friends who disagree with me on damn near everything about politics, but I can respect them because I think they're honest people, they're good people, and I can respect them. I may have to shoot them at some point, but I can at least respect them because they're basically decent people. So, always keep in mind that failure to embrace our ideas does not necessarily suggest that there's something wrong with them. Another point, and this is something that I seem to be the only one who really worries about this, or at least the only one who talks about it, and that is, understand, when you explain libertarian ideas to people, you may be asking them to engage in an intellectual self-examination that might be very painful. Let's say that, again, I use minimum wage laws because they're very important in my country. Let's say that you go to somebody who is very, very self-identified as pro-worker, thinks that capitalism grinds down the working man, and this is someone who perhaps has supported minimum wage laws, various types of governmental inventions in the labor markets, and you explain to that person carefully, clearly, and successfully that minimum wage laws may have hurt the very people they wanted to help. They genuinely wanted to help the working man, and then you help them understand that the laws they supported perhaps avidly hurt the very people they wanted to help. How painful would that be? By the way, if I were to ask Jacek Spindel, my good friend, Jacek, who are you? I would wager that a very large part of what he would use as his self-identification are his values, his commitments. Who are you? Jim Lark, I'm a libertarian. Well, if we ask people to face the fact that their commitment may have been to something that hurt people they wanted to help, that would be very painful. So we need to understand when we ask people to engage in our ideas, we may be asking them to engage in a painful self-examination we might not want to undergo. So always have a certain degree of sympathy or empathy with those with whom we're discussing these ideas. One thing that's particularly important, when I deal with a lot of college students, in fact, my niche in the liberty movement has largely, I guess you could say, it's basically been in campus organizing. I've been doing it for 40 years. And again, because our ideas are so beautiful, particularly campus activists, they're so disappointed when people don't become full-fledged libertarian, what I call whole hog libertarians. Well, it would be nice if they became whole hog libertarians at some point, but success comes in many ways. And one important way in which it comes is you may help them. It may be only on a small number of issues, but that's progress. And indeed, one of the things I mention here, one of the things that I think the vast majority of libertarian activists underestimate in terms of the value of their service is that they clear away the misconceptions that people have about libertarianism. In my experience, particularly on college campuses, I find that most people don't disagree with the general libertarian framework. What they disagree with are the very bad caricatures of the libertarian perspective and its implications. I just can't resist this. In 1987, when I was a graduate student, I started participating with a Marxist studies group at the University of Virginia. Now, it was not a sophisticated discussion of Marx. They did know that Karl Marx was not a member of the Marx Brothers, but it was not very sophisticated. And I went in as a libertarian. Now, they all knew I was a libertarian, and I said, look, I'm not here to argue with you, I'm here to listen, I'm here to learn. And they accepted me in that. Well, one evening, a professor of government and foreign affairs at the University of Virginia showed up, and I was introduced as the local libertarian. And this guy's a professor of government and foreign affairs. He said, oh, you libertarians believe that Brazil is a libertarian paradise. I have a bit of a sardonic wit, which I managed to keep in check. And I said, sir, with all due respect, I don't know any libertarian who believes that Brazil is a libertarian paradise. He then went on for 3 or 4 things. Well, you libertarians believe this. No, we don't. It was amazing how ignorant he was. And by the way, the final time he said, well, you libertarians believe this. Well, sir, no, we don't. And I explained to him. He said, well, you know, I guess I agree with you libertarians a lot. So just be aware that many people have misconceptions. And if all you do by virtue of your advocacy, if all you do is clear away the misconceptions, you have made tremendous progress. Because again, in so many cases, people don't really disagree with the general libertarian framework. What they disagree with are those dreadful misconceptions, those dreadfully bad caricatures. All right. When you meet someone, and you are a self-identified libertarian, you may be the liberty movement to that person. You may be the only self-identified libertarian that that person's ever met, so please treat them properly. Because in some cases, if people go away and say, oh, those libertarians, they're the ones who treated you like poop, merde, manure, they're probably not going to think well of you. So treat them the right way. Because again, you may make an impression, a lasting impression that never goes away. One thing that, and by the way, I love this quotation, which I got, Marshall Fritz lent it to me, it was attributed to Norman Vincent Peale. When you talk to people about libertarian ideas, try to listen to what is of interest or of importance to them. Not what interests you, but what interests them. And the Norman Vincent Peale line is, I like strawberries. When I go fishing, I use worms. I like that line. It just resonates with me because I like strawberries and occasionally I do go fishing. One thing that if we want to be effective advocates, we need to learn our economics and we need to learn our history. Because in so many cases, the arguments against a truly liberal society basically are based on what happened to the poor in the Industrial Revolution in England or what happened in the United States in the Great Depression. You need to know your history because in many cases people use bad history to try to support their arguments. And not necessarily because they're dishonest, but because maybe they don't know their history. So you have to educate yourself on these particularly important disciplines. By the way, I think if you understand economics, it is going to immunize you against a lot of really bad ideas. And I may be able to share another little story with you if time permits. Many of the most important things that you, by the way, you just give me the big hook. Just drag me off the stage when you're ready, assuming the audience doesn't do it. Many of the important points that you make, the most important points, have nothing to do with being a libertarian. I've mentioned minimum wage laws. Being opposed to minimum wage laws, in my opinion, has nothing to do with being a libertarian. That's just good economics. Opposing drug prohibition has nothing to do necessarily with being a libertarian. That's just good social science. So people don't have to fear, oh my God, I agree with those libertarians. I might be transforming or transmogrifying into a libertarian. No, you can be a statist and still agree with us on some important issues. We allow that. One thing I particularly like to do with students is I call this methods of analysis. Always, with people who perhaps don't share your libertarian values, say, look, all right, you may not share my libertarian values, but one thing you should always do, if you embrace the notion of giving government power in this area of human affairs, ask yourself the question, what happens if that power falls into the hands of the people you really don't like? And that's something everybody should be willing. That's a tool of analysis everyone should be willing to use. Another one, and this is particularly true in the United States, perhaps less true in other countries. The United States, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Well, that means the default value for any argument about government should be freedom. And that means that in an argument, the burden of proof is not us. It is not our responsibility to prove why freedom is right. The burden of proof is always upon those who would argue in favor of the coercive mechanism of government. It is their burden, not ours. We don't have to prove that freedom is good. That's the default value. The burden of proof is on them that what they're doing is morally right and prudentially good. This one, I think probably all of us in this room know about this. In so many cases, when we discuss libertarian ideas with people, what they do is they make an invalid comparison. They say, look at the possible problems of a libertarian society, and they compare that to a perfect society that does not exist, probably will never exist. Ending drug prohibition, for example. They say, well, we're going to have all these drug-crazed fiends running. We got a bunch of drug-crazed fiends running around right now. And if you actually measure apples to apples, if you look at all the horrible problems produced by drug prohibition, such as, for example, the United States invading countries in South America, the United States having an extraordinary problem where our inner cities look like, they basically large numbers of young, particularly young black men will never be able to get good jobs because they're convicted felons. Compare apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And again, that just simply, don't oversell the product. Libertarian societies, I think, will be, by any reasonable measure, will be better than their alternative institutional arrangements, but they won't be perfect. We, libertarians, usually do not like it when people on the other side overestimate the benefits and underestimate the costs of their preferred arrangements. Socialists. So we have to be, again, scrupulously honest and fair in assessing the alternative institutional arrangements. I like to change the terms of the debate where possible. People frequently talk about, drug legalization. Let's say ending drug prohibition, because in the United States, prohibition bad. People have some knowledge of history. Prohibition bad. So change legalization to ending drug prohibition. Change gun control to victim disarmament. I like that one. One thing, and this is something I think many libertarians, maybe they just don't have the opportunity to analyze this carefully. And that is, sometimes you find, as you're trying to explain libertarian ideas, you find you're actually debating a definition. I mentioned this Marxist studies group that I attended. One of the meetings we had, a young woman who was a PhD student in psychology was complaining bitterly about the racism of capitalism. Now, I don't like racism in any system, and I tried very politely to point out, we see racism, or more generally, tribalism, in all manner of societies, non-capitalist, pre-capitalist, anti-capitalist. It's there. And in fact, typically, in non-market-based societies, racism has much more ample scope to get really, really ugly. And I found in listening to her response, she didn't really rejoin, she just responded. I found out I was debating a definition. She had defined capitalism or market-arranged system. She used the term capitalism. She had defined essentially market-based systems as horrible systems which had among their horrible properties, they were racist. And it was useful for me to realize I was trying to debate a definition. It was very helpful. And sometimes you may find you're debating very bad definitions. Another point, in my country, you'll hear about so-called consumer advocates, people who are advocating usually in favor of government restrictions on market arrangements supposedly to protect consumers. I'm a consumer advocate. Ralph Nader, some of you may recognize the name of Ralph Nader, consumer advocate. Well, I'm a consumer advocate, and I advocate for what I think is the best protection of consumers, which is free markets combined with strict enforcement of contract against force or fraud. We, by and large, are the consumer advocates, not those. People talk about environmental advocacy. I'm an environmental advocate. Listen, I'm a Virginia hillbilly from Pulaski, Virginia. I grew up around a lot of pretty green mountains, and there ain't nobody more desirous of keeping those mountains pretty and green. I don't like people who, they call themselves environmentalists, know what they are. They're governmental activists, in many cases, trying to expand the control over the free people by government. There are better ways of protecting the environment and worse ways, and they almost always adopt the worse ways. Don't let them get away with calling themselves something that in some ways is misleading. I don't think they're really that concerned about the environment, at least not in many cases. This is one I just talked about. Ideological cross-dressing, very briefly. You can use, some arguments are traditionally associated with left or right. In many cases, you can show how arguments attributed or causes popular say among the right actually help the values of people on the left. And the classic example is right to keep and bear arms. Martin Luther King wrote about the fact that when he was protected by rural farmers in Alabama who happened to have guns. So they helped keep Martin Luther King perhaps from hanging, from a lamppost. A point here, what you say may not be what they hear. I believe, frankly, in getting rid of the Food and Drug Administration. But if I say abolish the FDA, many of the people in this room, when I say abolish the FDA, you're going to think greater variety of treatment, lower costs for treatment, hope for desperately ill people. Others might hear thalidomide or tainted meat. So understand what you say may not be what they hear. Maybe without in any sense softening your position, perhaps you phrase things like, maybe we improve the protection of consumers by giving them more choice. As I noted yesterday, never underestimate the good work you can do. Never underestimate just how much impact you can have. And as an activist for liberty, your reward for your activism, where you may do wonderful work, but you may never see the benefit of that work. Moreover, while you're doing that wonderful work, your reward, immediate reward, may be having people call you nasty names, or denying you a job, or cutting your salary. Understand, though, you may be doing absolutely wonderful work, and you may never see the fruits of your labor. The other point, and again, I mentioned this very briefly yesterday, some of the biggest victories you will win are not because you find the next great exemplar of libertarian values, but because you keep people going in the wrong direction. Samuel Johnson, again, I quoted the phrase, most ideas are not propagated by reason, but are caught by contagion. Who knows what might happen if there are a libertarian who introduces just enough sense, just enough good thinking, so that people don't go the wrong direction. By the way, I referenced Michael Harrington. That name may be unknown to you. Michael Harrington was a founder of the Democratic Socialists of the United States, and he was involved with a book called The Other America. And frankly, I didn't think much of him. I'm sure, by the way, that caused him to cry himself to sleep. I greatly appreciate your taking the time and trouble to be here. One of the great joys I have is meeting with fellow libertarians, indeed, heroes of a movement for a better society. So I thank you. My email address is jwlark@virginia.edu. If you think I can be of assistance to you, please do not hesitate to contact me. Helping my fellow libertarians is my favorite indoor sport. It is a great pleasure and a great honor to be with you. Thank you. Muchísimas gracias.